Good evening, and thanks to the First United Methodist Church for hosting this very informative presentation by our own Commissioner Jack Weinshanker, who's on the faculty at Rutgers University. I'd just like to introduce some of the members of the Commission who are here. Jack Weinshanker, co-chair, Reverend Al Brown, lead chair, Ann Frawley from the Prosecutor's Office, Karen Positano, who's in the back. Oh, Charlie Newman in the back. Hello, Charlie. How are you? Thank you for coming. Union County Human Relations Commission has been in existence since the early 1990s. It was a result of a directive from the Attorney General's office that every county have an organization in place to deal with issues regarding bias, diversity, hate crimes, etc. We're very fortunate here in Union County to have a very active commission. From time to time throughout the year we present various forums like this, and we're so fortunate to have Jack actually as a member of the commission. So Jack, I'd like to turn the program over to actually Reverend Brown for some few remarks. If you'd like to say something. Thank you.
And who are you?
My name is Jim Keefe. I'm a member of the commission. I'm the co-chairman. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming. In our work with the Human Relations Commission, one of our goals is to improve the quality of life for those of us who live in Union County. And in some of the discussions we've had over the years, we felt that it was necessary to have more dialogue with the community to identify issues and programs that would touch our conscience and help us to grow in understanding. Out of those conversations, we learned that one of our commissioners, Jack Weinshanker, had a great interest in that and has done some follow-up work in this area, and that led largely to our coming together tonight. We're hoping that the discussion we have tonight will be meaningful to you and that you'll support what I hope will be future opportunities for us to come together and discuss issues of significance within the community. It's my responsibility to formally introduce our speaker. Jack Weinshanker is a member of the Union County Human Relations Commission. He is a former co-chair. He's currently serving in the New Jersey Human Relations Council, and he serves on their executive council there. The presentation tonight on ethics is one which Jack is a part of the presentation that Jack makes for a course that he's teaching in a program for seniors, which is sponsored by Rutgers University. And so we're looking forward to what he has to say. Now, I want to cue you into something. Jack signed it up to me and said, in the course I teach, some things are controversial, but I'm not going to say them tonight. He said,
oh,
Jack,
darn. That's why we're here.
Right.
That's what I said.
That's what we said.
So,
Right.
there you are, Jack. Without further ado.
Controversy.
Yes.
Well, the reason why I say that, why I kind of shy away on a program like tonight, is because when you deal with controversy, you have to take time, because you have to build up to the subject, and you have to discuss the subject in enough detail so that you actually don't just deal with the rhetoric and don't just deal with the superficial. So it's only because of the lack of time that I really say that. It's not because we're afraid of dealing with ethical values that are controversial, or that we don't feel there are controversies that are justified in the areas of ethical values. That's not the problem. There are plenty, I assure you. But one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that when you're dealing with ethical values, you're talking about things that relate very much to a person's inner identity. These are not superficial things. A person's ethical values really are something that are derived not only from their own experience, their own immediate experience, but in fact from their ancestral lineage. Whether they're conscious of that or not, frankly, I don't think is too important, although I try to make that something that people are conscious of so that they understand the context that they're really dealing with when they're talking about ethical values. Some people will suggest that ethical values just whatever they think of. And we will get into enough of a discussion of that, hopefully to explain why I feel that's a mistake. Okay. Anyway, let's begin with the idea of what ethical values are, because although it might seem obvious, the truth is that in the conversations with most people are very uncomfortable discussing ethical values, because when you try to ask, okay, what are ethical values, most of the time, frankly, you get blank stares, because we don't even think of those things. It's not something that's before us in our conscious mind generally. It's things that we kind of take for granted. So what are ethical values? And I have to tell you that it depends what your ancestral lineage is and what your lifetime experiences are as to what ethical values are to you. For purposes of the definition in my course, when I present the material, the definition that I use is ethical values are guidelines for survival. There are many things that we have to choose as personal choices, many things that we have to do throughout our lives, and we have to make these very personal choices. And some of those choices, if we don't make them, quote, correctly, and we'll discuss that too, how do we know what's correct? If we don't choose correctly, lives can literally be at risk. And I don't think I have to tell you, all you have to do is just take a look at a headline in a newspaper. Almost every day you see murders, you see all kinds of criminal activity and all kinds of activity that isn't even considered criminal, but obviously it's unacceptable. And because of how the law is limited in terms of what it's supposed to do, what law enforcement is chartered to do, they can't really control the quality of our lives to that extent. There is a very limited role that law enforcement plays in terms of some of these life choices that people make. And that's not something that we can throw onto the legal enforcement system to have as a responsibility. Otherwise, they'll just be doing this all the time. And as a matter of fact, we don't want them making day-to-day personal choices for us, even though we may be making wrong choices. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. So the idea that there are choices in our lives that we have to be prepared to make, some of which are extremely serious. And there's a very important role of what happens as adults, and we try to raise a family. We try to raise children, and our responsibility as parents is to take the ethical value system that we inherited through our ancestral lineage and inculcate that, teach that to the next generation of youngsters, because they need that tie in order for them to survive. How many people here saw the movie March of the Penguins? March of the Penguins. I have to tell you that I started teaching the course about a year or so before that movie came out. And when the movie came out, my son says, "Go see the movie." Yeah, I thought it was a child's story, inconsequential movie. And I, against my better judgment, I thought at the time, I went to see the movie. And halfway through the movie, I said to my wife, "Norma, that's my textbook." I have to tell you that that movie dramatizes, or not dramatizes, it documents reality. It's actually a documentary of a 1-year life in the life cycle of a penguin, where they raise an offspring, and how they handle their responsibilities in that process. It's a one-year cycle. At the end of that year, that offspring is literally pushed out on its own. And just to give you an idea of how ethical values come in, during that one-year cycle, the male and female penguins are monogamous. After that year, they don't see each other again, which is a fascinating ethical value, but it's a recognition of the importance of the ethical value, even in the animal species, which I found so remarkable. In fact, perhaps it would be better if more humans recognized that ethical value rather than just the animals. But anyway, I'm joking. Don't take that as a confrontation, please. All right, so what we're saying is that there are some of these ethical values really involve life-threatening situations that can come. Can I get to the next slide, please? Okay. One of the questions that comes up is where is the dividing line between what law enforcement is supposed to do and what ethical values are supposed to do, where you make personal, voluntary choices. And just to cite some examples, I have to tell you these are just a few examples because the list is much longer than this. Hate speech is not illegal in this country. In fact, with great pride, we say that you can say whatever you want. In fact, not only that, but law enforcement has to defend you if you're threatened because of your hate speech. Now,
The First Amendment? I'm sorry.
yeah,
First Amendment.
exactly,
Freedom.
exactly. If there are any lawyers here, no, I better not tell that joke. No, but really, and this isn't a deficiency in the law. We're quite proud of this. We recognize that the right to free speech is very important. The question, though, becomes, is the right that is guaranteed with regard to freedom of speech a license to say hateful things? And that's where the partition comes in. Ethically, hate speech is not acceptable. Legally, they're entitled. But ethically, it's wrong and shouldn't be tolerated. But we have to express our lack of tolerance for hate speech in a legal way because they have that right to speak that way. So here's one of the clearest examples of where the law and ethical values have complementary responsibilities, but with very little overlap. There are a few exceptions with regard to speech, by the way. As an example, classically, yelling fire in a crowded theater. You're not allowed to do that. That's one of the limitations. The question is why? In the few cases where hate speech or speech in general is constrained, even though we have the general freedom of speech, what's the distinction? How do we know what speech is okay and what speech is not okay? And I think the law takes care of that by saying that if by your speaking, you are depriving someone else of their rights directly, like putting them in jeopardy in a crowded theater where a riot can easily take place, you're causing other people to be deprived of their rights, that can be stopped. But as long as all you're doing is talking and not really saying anything that's going to deprive them of their rights, you can get away with it. So the idea that, another example, by the way, if you incite a group of people to do violence against someone, and it can be shown that there is a direct connection between your incitement and an attack on somebody, that also the law will deal with. So the law is there to protect us from abuse when these things go too far and actually will impede our rights, which we're entitled to. But the rest of the control on what people say has to really come from other sources. And I have to use some recent examples that are very much in the news. The whole idea that Don Imus lost a very lucrative position in the media because of something he said, which was not illegal. He didn't say anything illegal, apparently, because that, I think, he would have been, there would have been repercussions if he did. But it certainly was objectionable. Ethically, it was terrible. He picked on some women or girls who did nothing to him. They didn't do him any harm. But he, in effect, defamed them with no justification. Legally, freedom of speech, everybody says, no censorship. Legally, you can't stop him from doing that. But what you can do is, if the community gets up on its feet when that happens and yells loud enough, people will say, hey, it's not acceptable. And then something can be done. That process has to also be done very carefully within the law. But very frankly, it's a good model, it's a good example of how we should be sensitive to ethical values and what our responsibilities are to respond to things that are unethical that are done, rather than just say, well, freedom of speech, he can say whatever he wants. The truth is that that isn't necessary as long as we respond in a lawful way. Okay? Stop bad eating habits. If anybody thinks that they can eat whatever they please, or prepare the food in any way they please, or handle the food in any way they please, it's just wrong. I know that I was raised ever since I was a young boy in how to be careful about food. I was put on a vitamin supplement regimen ever since I was probably 10 years old, and I've been on it ever since, and I'm now in my middle 70s. So I think that there's something for that speaks for itself. But in addition to which, the idea of what kinds of foods to eat, how to focus on what a balanced diet is. The law is not going to force you to eat the kind of foods you should eat to sustain your own life. Just an example of how, if you think food doesn't necessarily sustain life, you know that most people eat white food, white bread, white flour products, white cereals. And you'll notice that if you look at the ingredients, or even if you try to buy just flour, what you will find is that all flour, or at least as far as I know, all flour in the United States, is labeled enriched. Now, what does enriched mean? They add vitamins and minerals into it that are removed during the processing, because they recognize that what they remove is so important to the sustenance of life that if you want to call bread the staff of life, it has to have those nutrients. The white flour is the part of the plant, part of the wheat, that doesn't have nutrients. Now, the law comes into play and puts some restrictions on there and requires you to have enrichment in the bakery products, in the flour. But because people don't know, people have no way of knowing. They'll be eating things that they think are the staff of life, but they're not. So they, in effect, are being deceived. The question is then, how does one acquire the knowledge or the habit of eating the right kinds of foods? And that's where the family, the ancestral lineage comes into play. Your parents taught you what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat. You didn't always listen to them, but at least they taught you. And I have to tell you, my children are now grown, and during the formative years, we kind of coerced them into eating certain foods and taking vitamin supplements, which they rebelled against at one point in their growing up process. And now, as they're a little older and they have children, now they're coming back to the whole grain products and the vitamins and minerals, because they recognize now when their children are their responsibility, they become much more conscious of the importance of that kind of information being communicated to these youngsters, so that when they grow up and they have children, they will be able to look back at what they were taught, so that their children will have the same benefit of that information. Okay. The law will not prevent children from learning bad ethical values. If you want, as a parent, want to teach them bad ethical values, you can do it. You can teach them about you can teach them that it's not important what you eat or how well the foods that you eat are taken care of. And I have to tell you, one of the things that I did when I was my early days of a citizen of Clark, I was involved in a committee that helped the municipal council draft legislation, ordinances for the town, and one of the ordinances that we worked on was a food handlers ordinance, food handling and food handlers ordinance, and I became very aware of what the requirements are, even under the law, in terms of if something is supposed to be refrigerated, it's supposed to be refrigerated, and if it's not refrigerated, if that refrigeration process is interrupted for a certain period of time, they can't sell that product. Most people aren't aware of this. Most people just go into a store and they assume, but it's important for people to know that if during that process that was interrupted, you could have serious problems. The whole idea of E. coli, the whole idea of eating hamburgers that are rare, because people love, how can you eat a hamburger that's really cooked? The answer is very simple, that if you eat a rare hamburger, you can die. It's that simple. Even in the best store. And that's why in some states and in some store chains, they won't serve you a rare hamburger. Sometimes I'm afraid the food establishments get a little sloppy, but the law won't protect us to that extent, that we have to be our own protectors in that sense, and we have to teach our children that they have to protect themselves in that sense. And that's a huge responsibility we have as a parent, and as a matter of fact, we really don't expect or want someone else to be teaching our children those kinds of values. We really want to have that responsibility for ourselves, because we're really the ones who care the most about them. The law is not going to prevent you from choosing a lifestyle that can destroy your marriage. Best example of that is the President of the United States, Bill Clinton. And I don't mean this as a political statement, but look what happened with his life and what it meant to his marriage. And this was all done out in the open, where the whole world watched this on television over and over again. And the law, the only thing the law was able to challenge him on was on lying about it, because he lied under oath, supposedly. So what he did, what he chose to do, the lifestyle choice he made, wasn't the issue. It was the fact that he lied under oath. That was the issue. And that's sad, because somehow that pain that he caused to his wife and to his daughter is something that he really should be accountable for, because he was teaching by doing that. And not only was he teaching his own child, but unfortunately he was teaching a whole nation of children because of it being on the daily news, network news every night. Next slide, please. Okay, what makes right or wrong, good or bad, ethical values? Since we've defined ethical values being guidelines for survival, it makes sense to say that right or good are things that encourage survival. And when we say encourage survival, we don't just mean instantaneously. We mean not only for myself in my own life, but for my children, that there will be continuity for my children, and continuity over generations. A lot of people like to think that good is just subjective. Some people think it's good, some people think it's bad. I believe it's much more than subjective, and that it's linked to the question of does it encourage survival or does it undermine survival? And what that says is that it's not a matter of whim. It's not a matter of personal like or dislike. It's not a matter of what makes you feel good. It's much more than that. It's a matter of survival in the multi-generational sense. My background is electrical engineer. I worked all my life as an electrical engineer. And one of the things that we learned, and a very important part of electronic and electrical system design, is the idea that every system has a characteristic time, a response time, that if you disturb the system, it takes a certain period of time for that disturbance to work its way through. And sometimes those things can be long. Sometimes it can be, like you disturb a pendulum, that'll just keep swinging for quite a while before it comes to rest. So that characteristic time is a very, very, go ahead.
I was just going to make the observation, the right and wrong, bad or good. I don't think anybody relates that to survival. I mean, it seems to be so far.
I do.
Well, you may, because
I
you're
do.
talking about the subject.
To me, that's the only thing that really matters.
Well, the average person discussing right or wrong.
And that's why we make a point. But that's why we make a point of talking about it. Okay?
It never enters my mind.
Well, it is. Unfortunately, it is. And I'll give you some. We'll go into some
a lot of validity in what you're
very
saying,
important examples. Okay. And by the way, I've already mentioned some. The idea of choosing foods, or choosing sex habits, sex lifestyle. You know, anybody ever have any contact with an AIDS baby, or an AIDS or a crack baby? Anybody ever see that? Now that's the result of a life choice, a personal choice. That's not an accident. That's not something that happens out of the blue. Somebody makes a choice that very, very devastatingly influences the life of a person, especially an innocent baby. So these are the kinds of choices I'm talking about. That's the kind of choice, that's an ethical choice. By the way, a lot of choices are just lifestyle choices that don't involve survival. And then it doesn't matter what choice you make. It's okay to make whatever you like. But when it becomes a matter of survival, that becomes important. Teaching children how to eat properly, how to avoid rare hamburgers, as an example. That's survival, literally. Okay, I hope that point is clear. But that's a very important point to me. Okay, next slide, please. So right versus wrong is not a matter of whim, not what feels good, not based on what I can get, and a lot of people will say, hey, if I can get away with it, must be okay. And that's not what it is.